I just wanted to make a couple comments about yesterday's event, which he repeated for us at the Levi Adult Center. Of course, we had more seats at the Levi Adult Center because we have plenty of parking over there, and I imagine that's why we're not here today. We actually have, I think it's like 49 registered for this series to that. But he did such an excellent job in explaining China, a 5,000-year-old country, in 2 hours. And I'm looking forward to hearing it again. Ambassador J. Stephen Rhodes.
Thank you, Mr. Washington. But that's the advantage of having Mr. Washington. Good looking and smart. And self-employed. This guy spent a little time in the American industry. He grew up in, I don't know if you know this, but he grew up in Florida. He was, his family was military, so he traveled all around, which is both good and bad. It poses some challenges, but that exposure to different places made him part of who he is, along with his family, of course. He's a graduate of USC, and since I graduated from Loyola University, I'm not going to hold that against him. But he also got his MBA from University of Phoenix. Now, you got to be pretty important when people quote you on comments that you've made. You want to hear a couple of his? How about this? I eat to live, not live to eat. Moderation is the key to life. The only thing necessary for triumph over evil is for good men to do nothing. Edmund Burke. This brother's a philosopher, you know. Growing up in New Orleans, as I did, it was a different time. When I was okay, so I have to hold it like this. When I was in 8th grade, this was right after the Civil Rights Bill, and I was a pretty good basketball player, 13, something like that. And I remember we integrated the CYO, Catholic Youth Organization. And I remember going up for a layup and using my left hand because that was a big deal. Can you go to your left? And we were beating this, in those days we would say this white school, and we were beating these guys. And I remember getting booed, and it bothered me because that was a nice play, that looked good. So that's kind of what we're going to kind of talk about today is perception. One of the things that, let's see if I got this right. Okay. One of the things that I think the West got wrong was our perception of China. And in many ways, it's a function of the environment that we saw. You know, in the Second World War, it was a conflict. In the history of man, two things have caused conflicts. One is quest for land and resources. Our territory. And the other, okay, let's back up. So let me start with this. All of us went to school, and in elementary school, we learned about the French and Indian War. Now, do you really know what caused the French and Indian War? Anybody?
Conflict in Europe.
That's close. It had to do more with trade. People from England who settled in the 13 colonies, particularly Virginia, is where this is centered. Most of the good land was taken, but Europeans were still coming into Virginia. And the reason people came here to the United States from Europe was for the prospect of wealth, land. Land has always been equated with wealth. So most of the good farming land was already taken. The planters there had huge plantations, or farms as some people want to call them, and the influx of more people caused a problem because they wanted land and there was none. And the people who had land weren't giving it up. So, a buddy of mine who I played football with 100 years ago, Tony Parent, Dr. Anthony Parent now, is a full professor at Wake Forest. He is an authority on a slave society in Virginia, and he's doing the sequel to his book. Last time I was here, I showed you a copy of the cover of his book called Foul Means. He's doing a sequel to that picks up from 1736 up to the Revolutionary War. But doing the research, Tony was telling me that he saw that so much of what happened in the development of our country had to do with land and trade. And then he said he started to look at treaties that we had with the Native Americans about who could move in certain hunting areas. And what he saw was that let's call them British, were living in Virginia, needed to expand west into the Ohio Valley. The French were in the Ohio Valley, and they liked it there because there was a big market for furs and skins in Europe. And beavers were plentiful in the Ohio Valley, and they liked that. There was a lot of money to be made. So that's really what started the war. It was expansion west, and it resulted in the French being displaced from where they were because the colonists wanted more. So as I said, quest for territory, and not only territory, but resources. Territory equates to resources. Political domination is the other thing that causes conflicts. And we got to keep that in mind as we begin to look at China. The American Revolution is a good example of political domination. The colonists were determined that they no longer wanted to have to report to England. They didn't want to be dominated by England. It was a conflict. And that's what caused the war. So much so that King George thought that this little rebellion would be over in no time, but it wasn't, as you all know. In the course of this, we're also going to be talking about tactics that people use to resolve conflicts. To resolve conflicts when we talk about battles and stuff like that. French Revolution was another example of where change took place over governing and how people would be governed. What was going to determine the fate of the people in a particular country. Monarchies came to an end, essentially with the French Revolution. Now, we still have monarchies in England, but they are not the government per se, right? So, let's begin to look at China in that context, okay? And this is what I try to do in my classes. I try to make sure my students have sort of a historical background before we get into the subject, so there's some context for it. All right, in 1979, Deng Xiaoping came to the United States. And here's Deng Xiaoping. Okay, I have this very expensive pointer, so I have to use it. Deng Xiaoping, as you can see, is a little guy. And he was at a rodeo in Texas. And this is the picture that made all the newspapers and showed up in the news at night. Now, when you look at this fella, he doesn't look like a very threatening human being, does he? I mean, he's a little guy, he's putting on a cowboy hat, he seems very affable. And that's the picture that most people in the United States took, and we superimposed our values on what we saw. Big mistake. So let's go back a little bit. During the Second World War, there were two factions in China, both fighting against the Japanese. Okay, Chiang Kai-shek and his wife represented a democracy, for lack of a better word. And she was pardon me? Oh, sorry. She was particularly helpful to the Allies and the Chinese people because she spoke English very well. She was educated in the West. And people felt comfortable dealing with Deng Xiaoping. Now, at the same time, you'll recall that Mao Zedong, representing the Communist Party of China, was a faction. But like the Civil Rights Movement, there were a lot of different factions of the Civil Rights Movement. NAACP, SNCC, Southern Christian Leadership, Urban League. But all these different organizations in the Civil Rights Movement could agree on one thing: the elimination of Jim Crow laws in the South. Same thing happened here. These guys, both Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, they agreed that we got to get rid of the Japanese. And the Japanese did some horrible things in their country. But Mao Zedong ended up winning the struggle after the war. You all know this, okay? But two things that Mao did. One was his great, too much technology here. His great leap forward was a miserable failure. People were starving. It was a miserable failure. And when he saw that it was failing and he was losing the approval, I can go like this, I know like this in the works. When he saw that it was losing and was not, remember, this is communism, this is real communism under Mao Zedong. And what's interesting about this form of communism was he was the main guy. We're going to talk about that in a second. But his great leap forward failed. It was not a great leap forward. And what he replaced it with was a great proletarian cultural revolution. Frequently you hear referred to as just a cultural revolution. The cultural revolution was a radical, harsh, and brutal revolution within China. And what Mao Zedong did was he systematically killed millions of people who didn't agree with him. And it was a purge. And the interesting thing about this was he actually thought this through, and he appealed to the younger people, young kids, college age or something like that, and made them the focus of this. And they would go around with direction from people in the party to eliminate his opposition. Needless to say, it wasn't successful, and they weren't a part of the world community. But in what you've seen, these three leaders, Deng Xiaoping, who's more modern, and Generalissimo, Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong. These guys all followed the model of Sun Tzu. You may have heard of the Art of War, but the Art of War actually started with in about the 5th century BC, where, let me pull up my notes here, I want to get this right for you. Okay. So, listen, it really is directional sensitive.
Yeah, the more that you're center, the further you go back, the worse perception you get. So come up a little bit, but don't get in front of the screen. That's it. Okay.
No, a long time ago, I learned to take directions. So, when we talk about Sun Tzu, let me give you a little background here. In the 5th century BC, King Huawei had a kingdom of roughly, 100,000 people. He had an army of 30,000 people. But he wanted to go to war with a neighboring country. But they were outnumbered like 3-1. So he heard about Sun Tzu and brought him in to see what he was really talking about and if it made any sense. So he said, he brought Sun Tzu in, who claimed that he could make anyone a warrior and teach the warriors to operate as a unit and be successful in any battle. So King Halu brought him in and took him into his harem. So where there were, close to 100 concubines. And he said, if you can teach anyone to be a warrior, teach these women to be warriors. And Sun Tzu said, okay, I can do that. So what he did was he found the 2 senior people, 2 senior women, and he made them platoon leaders. And he showed them how to drill, how to use their arms, spears and stuff. And he said, now that you've learned this, whenever you hear the drum, you go into formation. So the next day, the drum sounded, the women started laughing, and they didn't go into formation. So Sun Tzu says, if your people don't understand the orders that are given, it's the commander's fault. So the next day, he did the same thing. After explaining to the platoon leaders what they were supposed to do and what they were supposed to have their platoon do, and the drum sounds, and the women laugh again, and no one goes into formation. So Sun Tzu walks out, finds the 2 platoon leaders, and immediately decapitates them. That got everybody's attention. He appointed 2 new platoon leaders. And the next day when the drum sounded, everybody was in formation. I tell you that because Sun Tzu had roughly 13 different chapters in his book, The Art of War. People use it to this day. Essentially, what Sun Tzu says is, well, let's show you. This is a replica of what he probably looked like. He says, to subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. In the West, now remember, this is different from a 5,000-year-old society. In the West, we think of wars as wars of attrition. So typically, one army lines up against the other, and they shoot at each other, and whoever's left standing wins. Sun Tzu saw that as a waste of humanity and was not the most efficient way to wage war. Plus, war is not just an instrument of its own. It's an instrument that has a political purpose. So you don't want to lose people if you don't have to. So what he believes is that what you have to do is outthink your opponent. Let me stay with this for a second. So, King Halu's army, as I said, was 30,000. He was facing an army that some people say is between 100 and 300,000. So, if you just think of the way you would typically have a battle, there's no way that these guys can win. They were outnumbered at most 10 to 1, maybe something less. So how did he win and become successful? Through diversion, through misdirection, through spies, through false, I'm trying to think of the right term, through deception, meaning he would leak information that wasn't true. So what he would typically do was give the impression that he was going one way and his army was going to be coming in to attack a group of the opposition. And that would just be a shallow group where the main force was hitting them on their flanks. And he did this constantly. When his opposing general caught on to what he was doing, Sun Tzu forged what looked like the main body of his army. And as his opponent brought all their troops forward to annihilate them, Sun Tzu swung around behind them, captured the city, won the battle, and circled these guys. So that thinking has gone on throughout history. Football coaches read this book and they practice this. I played football 100 years ago, as I said. And from time to time, if you watch a game, you'll notice that the flow seems to be going one way and the play takes place on the other side of the field. In running plays, it's called a veer, where the tailback, the running back, will move in one direction. The blockers look like they're going in that direction, and he cuts back, and they form a wall. That's Sun Tzu. Okay. So, going back to 1979, the West became really infatuated with Deng Xiaoping because they saw him implementing change. So, for some reason or another, in the West, and I think as a part of our arrogance, why? We won the First World War, Second World War. In 1990, we saw the Berlin Wall fall. Communism went out of existence, as we know it, the Soviet Union. And we began to think that in the future, everybody's going to be like us, the West, where democracy reigns. And we thought surely this is going to happen, particularly given the fact that, given the fact that Deng Xiaoping had changed the way the economy was working in China. He opened it up and allowed for trade. The second myth that we had, and remember, this is not just the United States, this is Western Europe as well. Australia. So let's say the British Empire, Western Europe, the United States, France, well, Western Europe. Okay, here we go. So that picture of Deng Xiaoping and the cowboy hat had a big impact. And people forgot history, and they just assumed that China was a peaceful country. But remember, for the better part of 5,000 years, there are all sorts of wars that were fought in China. It was not until King Haolu won his victory that China actually became China, because he subdued the rest of the little kingdoms and fiefdoms. But after that, China was invaded by both the Mongolians and the Manchu. But no one can control China. No one can rule China. So even though the Mongolians came in and they defeated these guys in battle, they then relied on the Chinese to run the governments in those little local communities. And the same thing happened with the Manchu. You've heard of Manchuria and stuff. These guys conquered the Chinese, but it was a battle. But as we all know, that when you win a battle, you now have to occupy the area. And no one could occupy the area, so that they put the Chinese in leadership roles. And that has been the history of China until a little later on in history, which changed everything. So, Deng Xiaoping in 1921 goes to the Soviet Union because the Chinese are still developing their platform in China, and they want to learn from the best. So they go to the Soviet Union, and they meet Vladimir Lenin. Now, what's significant about Vladimir Lenin is his form of communism is a totalitarian state with a strong leader at the top who is supported by the political party, and the political party is supported by the military. And that's what Deng Xiaoping learned. He helped form the Chinese Communist Party. This little guy was instrumental in forming China's Communist Party. Okay, as I said, it goes back to 1921. Now, here's some things that you need to take into consideration. China has 1.4 billion people. It's pretty large. Look at this. Their middle class is 300 million, roughly 300 million people. 300 million people is roughly the size of the United States. The Communist Party is made up of roughly 90 million people. And a member of the party has to be on every corporate board in China, in every community organization. Any group that meets, there has to be a representative of the party. And let's remember, it's a totalitarian government with a strong leader at the top. So all this information that they collect gets fed up. And one guy has control over what happens with that information and how to react to it. One person. Now, when you look at what took place in the Soviet Union, they had a Politburo. And it was a whole, well, let's call it, for lack of a better word, their version of a Congress. And decisions were made in the Politburo. So even if you were Gorbachev, you couldn't act independently. These other guys had to agree with you. Not so with the Leninist form of communism. One guy controls it all. So their Communist Party, just to give you some frame of reference, is it's equivalent to the population of California, Texas, and Florida. It's a lot of people, 90 million. Now, let me back up. Here's the other thing, well, we'll continue. So Deng Xiaoping in the late 90s, when he's taken over from Mao, and he's implemented all these changes in their economy, making it freer, he gives a talk called the Southern Talks, where he goes to the southern parts of China, and he's liberalized their economy, right? And he's quoted with this statement: "I don't care if a cat is black or white, as long as it can catch mice." Now, what was he talking about? In the old forms of communism, the thought was everything's controlled by the state, and the state profits, and there's no particularly advantage for individual achievement or success financially. I remember talking to a guy from the Soviet Union who told me that they were in the glass business. He was in the glass business, and they were the largest glass company in the Soviet Union. And he said that they didn't sell any glass. They would show up for work, and the stuff was poorly made. It would break, and that's how they spent their day. The next day they'd come back and do the same thing. And what they produced was maybe 10% of the production that they have that was actually saleable. But he said that went on for years because the government controlled it. And no one was responsible for the total output. Here, Deng Xiaoping changes that. And remember, okay. All right, so in 1839, things changed in China in a way that they never expected and had never happened in almost 5,000 years. We're talking about trade with China, right? And tariffs. And in 1839, China got into quarrels with the British merchants about trade. The British, as you know, the British Isle is a small little island, and they've made their fortunes through trade. When you travel around, at one point, particularly back as far as Queen Victoria, the sun never set on the British Empire because they had little places all around the world, and some of these islands, they would stock them with animals like sheep and stuff, and they planted fruit trees, breadfruit and the rest, so that as they traveled around they could restock. So tea was a big thing, as well as sugar. But somewhere along the line, somebody realized that there was more money to be made in opium. And the British wanted to sell more opium into China. A lot of people. Now, they were already doing some of this, but it was in isolated little towns that were near shore. But it was devastating those communities. Communities that were once profitable we're now seeing an epidemic with people being addicted and wasting times at opium dens, and it was destroying the fabric of their economy. Think about that. It's somewhat similar to opioids and other drugs that we've encountered in our society. Again, history repeats itself. So the Chinese, after long negotiations, they arrested and commandeered a British ship that had opium. They wouldn't let them land the opium. The British heard about it, and they started a war. And remember, around this time, Britain probably had the best navy in the world. They had armaments like the Chinese didn't have. And it was an ugly war where the Chinese were just completely overwhelmed. Part of the concession that happened, oh, and by the way, they went to war twice, okay? The concession to help with a ceasefire was China had to concede Hong Kong, Singapore, as well as more, they had to allow the British to move further into the interior of China for trade. This caused real hardship with the government because they lost face. People now foreigners took land from them that was theirs, and they controlled it, and the British enforced it. Now, when this happened, the people in Singapore and Hong Kong now found themselves under British rule. And what that has done is what is contributing to what you see going on right now in Hong Kong. They're used to the rule of law. These are the three areas in China that are not under the rule of Communist China. Taiwan is the last of these three countries or areas because they are a result of the war between Mao and the Generalissimo. So they have their own island. What's interesting about Taiwan is they do not have diplomatic status in the United States. So their representative to the United States is referred to as representative as opposed to an ambassador. But they have a house in Washington. These guys cover all the political branches, the House, the Senate, and the executive branch better than any other country that I've seen because they have a concern that they don't want to be overrun by China. Okay, their economy has thrived over the years when China was having problems. So these three places are atypical of Communist China. Okay. If you're going to be a communist country, what you can't allow is protests against the government, meaning the party leaders. You have to keep a tight rein on that. You don't want dissenters running around saying bad things about the leader. If you do that, that could grow, and as you saw what happened in the Soviet Union, it ended up toppling the Union. So, this is a picture of Tiananmen Square. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because, once again, in the West and the United States in particular, we believe in a free press. We believe that information is information, and people should have access to all the information that's available, and it's up to them to determine what to do with it. If you were in China, in communist China, and went to the library, you would see no references to Tiananmen Square, where all these people were killed. As far as they're concerned, in history, it doesn't exist. Now, controlling the media is what you want to do in a totalitarian form of government. Let me give you another example. In the Second World War, my tear ducts had shrunk here, so I kept trying to see the tear. It's not that the subject matter is so sensitive to me. Anyhow, so in the Second World War, this is kind of interesting. Hitler understood the importance of controlling the media. And Goebbels was his guy who communicated everything. He was the head of communications for the Nazi Party. So what they did was they made sure that every household in Germany had a radio. And they made these little cheap radios that were preset at a dial, and that was the only thing that the German people could listen to. They couldn't listen to KCRW and all the rest of it. It was just what was being broadcast by Goebbels and the boys. But this is their way of getting news. And again, radios in Germany in the 30s was still sort of a new form of technology. Not everybody had one. So suddenly now you have a radio, which is what only rich people had. And you were able to get messages, hear music, hear speeches, and all that kind of stuff. But Goebbels controlled everything that was said on the radio. Okay, well, let's bring it back to China. So, if you were in China, by the way, is anybody here from China? Okay, well, I was going to ask them to verify this. But if you're in China, you don't have unlimited access on the internet. The internet has become the great equalizer throughout the world. And I guarantee you it's going to cause some unrest in places where it's free and open. Because, like television, when people can see how people live in other parts of the world, now they have something to compare to their own Sitzenleben, or as they say in German, their situation at hand, Sitzenleben. Let me give you an example of this. When I was ambassador to Zimbabwe, I didn't want to just stay in Harare and go to the parties and talk to ambassadors. And I got into a little trouble with some of the people in my embassy because that's what they like to do, you know? It was a lot more fun to go to a reception at the British High Commissioner's place or the French ambassadors and swap stories with their staff and then write about that and send it back to Washington. I wanted these guys to get out and know the governors, to meet the chiefs, and be able to talk firsthand about what's going on in the country. I learned that in my first job at the White House when I was responsible for local government. Representatives of these people can tell you what they think you want to know. But it's another thing when you can actually say, I talked to this chief. So, here's a story. I decided I was going to go meet one of the chiefs. And in Africa, we started out on a highway that was like a 4-lane highway, just like here. And then all of a sudden, the road got a little smaller and it became 2 lanes. Then it became 1 lane. And then it became like 2 little pads where you had to keep your car on the concrete path. And then eventually that's so that if some other car's coming, somebody's got to get off the pad. And then you get on the dirt road. So we've now gone into the dirt road, and I go out and I end up at this chief's house. And this is 1990. So I end up at this chief's place, and he's got a hut. And he's got, as I recall, 6 other smaller huts around his. And those were, they believe in polygamy, so these were different wives. Okay? So he wanted me to meet his number 1 son. Now, by the way, when you're that far in, as they say, the bush, you don't have electrical power. There was no running water. But I gotta tell you, this place was spotless. But here's the thing. He wanted me to meet his son. Number 1 son. So this kid comes out of one of the little huts there. That's the truth. And he's wearing a Los Angeles Dodger baseball cap. He's got a basketball jersey with Magic Johnson's number, 32. And he's got a Sony Discman. You know, this is before iPods. And he's got a Sony Discman. And he's listening to Run DMC. And all he wanted to do was talk to me about America. Okay, now, see, they had access to communications. And that's how this kid knew all this stuff. Anyway. So, if you control the media, as what's happening in China right now, you get to tell people what you want them to know, and you limit their access to outside influences. So, I've been working with some people who want me to go to China and teach mediation. So we were trying to have a conversation with people in China about what we need to do to actually be licensed to do this over there. And to my surprise, what I found was there was only limited forms of communication with these guys. We couldn't just call them directly. You couldn't FaceTime anybody. And you can only use something called WeChat because the other systems were shut down. So, remember, communist country, control the media. All right, now here's the next problem that we have when we talk about China. Frequently, people will refer to to President Xi as the President of the People's Republic of China. And he really is. But he's got 2 other jobs. And this job is the least important of his other jobs. When we deal with President Xi, we have to keep in mind that his first job is Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party. Now remember, we went through this a little bit earlier about the size of the Communist Party. 90 million people. That's where it starts for him. The next thing that his job, in order of importance, is he's chairman of the Military Commission. The Military Commission is the Army. Okay? It's the People's Liberation Army. Okay? And he's the chairman of that. Now, what's different about these 2 jobs that he has is the Communist Party, as I said earlier, controls what goes on. So yeah, they may have a free economy, but as you have heard, there's someone from the party noticing everything that's going on. So all this information gets fed to the top. In our country, our military is designed to protect the people. Our military is designed to protect America. In China, the military's first job is to protect the Communist Party. The Communist Party is able to enforce their edicts because they control the media. Now, what is significantly different about that? In the United States, parties don't control the government. The government controls the parties. Okay? In China, the party, there's only one party, and it controls the military. Xi's base is the Communist Party, and if there's a problem enforcing his edicts, he can employ these guys to enforce what the party, Xi, wants to do. Now think about that. In our country, our military can't be used against the citizens. Not so in China. We'll get into that in a second. So this is President Xi. He's got some problems right now, both with trade as well as these nuts in Hong Kong and Singapore who are talking about democracy and the rule of law. That doesn't work. So here's a picture of what Hong Kong looked like when it was ceded to the British. Okay? So this is actually when it happened, 1840. Okay, 1982, Margaret Thatcher looks over the surveys of the world and the British Empire and realizes we're not going to be able to hang on to our colonies much longer. So Margaret sends a delegation, and they meet with the Chinese. This was Mao Zedong at the time. And they agree that, this was Deng Xiaoping, and they agree that that Hong Kong will return. God, I left the comment. Hong Kong will return to China midnight, July 1, 1997. Okay, now, when that happened, remember, Hong Kong is operating under the rule of law. That's real different from China. So what's going on right now is China, like every other country that wants to be a world power, wants to control their environment. Let's go back one show. See this military commission here? Within the military commission, the People's Liberation Army, there is a division that's dedicated to stealing intellectual properties. So they have people spending all their time figuring out how to hack into people's internet stuff. Their job is to figure out how they can listen to different stuff with keywords. But spying is actually a better word. But there's a division, and that's their sole purpose. Now, why is that to their advantage? A couple reasons. If you want to control something, information is power. But there's also an economic reason to it too. Why not have the most up-to-date technology without having to spend money on R&D to get there? If you can just steal it from somebody. And that's their approach. Now, having said that, what's important to understand is they don't see this as stealing. What they see is this is a way of putting China first. China has a right in the minds of the Leninist group of communism. They have a right to do whatever is necessary that will benefit the party. Okay, so I'm going to start with a few examples here. Huawei, you familiar with, have you heard that? Okay. Huawei was just indicted by the FBI. And look what they were indicted for. Conspiracy to defraud banks, theft of trade secrets, okay? They see this as just a way of doing business. We see it as trade infringement and a variety of other things. China and global trade, remember, China wants to get back to where they were. China, until 1839, was without question the largest economy in the world. They were known for all the riches and goods that the world wanted. Marco Polo, remember? Went to China because that was the seat of culture and everything new and innovative. China's always been like that. In 1839, they lost face. They were discredited, and it had long-range effects and impacts on the people and in the society. We, in the West, unfortunately looked at China and thought of them as backward, coming off of World War II. They weren't. And remember, their model for success is Sun Tzu. They'll never confront you, and just because they're polite doesn't mean that they don't have a purpose. So let's back up here. Let me tell you a little bit about this China Road and Bridge Corporation. A few years ago, I was on the board of an oil and gas company called Ivanhoe Energy. And our focus was heavy oil. Heavy oil typically is not desirable for an oil company because heavy oil does not flow through a pipeline. The best example of heavy oil is the La Brea tar pits. What you see as tar, that's actually crude oil, but it's been degraded through bacteria and other things, so it's hard. If you add heat to it, it'll become viscous and you can move it through a pipeline. If you can add heat and remove asphaltenes and metals, it becomes a higher grade of crude. In the Middle East, when we talk about specific gravity and the value of oil, the lighter it is, the better, because it's easier to refine. To give you a feel of reference, water, and I'm sure many of you guys remember this from chemistry, water specific gravity is 10. So that's why oil floats. It has a higher specific gravity, okay? In the Middle East, their oil is around 35. So water 10, 35 it floats. With heavy oil, it can be anywhere from 5 to 15. That won't flow through a pipeline. You get it to 15 and keep the pipeline heated over. Okay, so throughout the world, and remember, as I said earlier, territory and expansion for resources has been the source of conflict throughout history. In South America, so we had this plant And we were awarded a contract in Ecuador, 250 square miles to look for heavy oil. And it was heavy oil, but that's why it wasn't used. And we formed a relationship with the university, and we got the lease for nothing. It was free because of a loophole in the law. But here's the thing. What we were going to do was develop our reservoir engineers told us that they thought there was probably 10 billion barrels of oil in this field, in the fields that the part that they tested. 250 square miles is a lot of lease area. So we had this technology that was portable, for lack of a better word, modular. And what it could do is take heavy oil and increase its gravity so you can move it through a pipeline. Typically, that costs about $6 billion to put in a coking or a cracking plant. These things are huge. And their only job is to extract this heavy oil, take the asphaltenes out. Asphalt is made from heavy oil, and the metals. And then they put it through a pipeline so it can go into the refinery to be refined. We had this technology where, and these things are huge, by the way. They're huge factories. And just putting the oil through this, that doesn't make one penny for the oil company, but it puts them in a position to do it. Anyhow, we had technology that would allow you to not destroy the environment by putting in a huge plant like this. The footprint, I think, was 50 by 50, and they could do 15,000 barrels a day. That's not a whole lot, but you'd put in more of them around the field. Anyhow, the reason I'm telling you this is we got this land, this lease, and before we were even able to put in our facility, which was called HTL, Heavy to Light, we got an offer from the Chinese where they would give us, oh, by the way, when we acquired this land, because of the loophole in the law, we didn't pay anything for it because our partner was the university. And obviously this was going to be a teaching facility for them as well. So the Chinese came to us and they offered us $66 million to pick up the lease. And they were going to give us, I think the number was like 30% royalty once they began to extract oil. We'd invested nothing, but they were that committed to being able to control this resource that they saw this as a long-term opportunity. To make a long story short, the inept people in the organization where I was on the board rejected the offer. We ended up losing the lease because we didn't do the development like we should have. We had to spend, I don't know, $24 million within the first 24 months. And I don't know what's happening right now. But my point here is this is happening throughout the world. China has gone around and they've invested in natural resources throughout the world. South America, they've done tons of investing in Africa. So they have access to resources. Then, you need resources to build your economy. How are we doing with time? Is it time for a break?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay. That's going on politically right now has to do with trade and how we interact with China. The most important thing to understand here is that China is a huge economy. And as I pointed out earlier, They got 3 million people in what is considered middle class. This was an amazing economic feat, because 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. And it's all happened since they have liberalized their economy. Now, you hear a lot of political pundits say that China is going to overtake the United States and that China is a threat to the United States. Niet. The reason I say niet is because China's entire economy is based on exporting of goods and services. We have a domestic economy that looms and thrives. Exports are important to us, but a lot of the business that we do is here in the United States. 100 years ago, when I was in graduate school, business school, we talked about what makes an economy work. And it was production. And the other thing that we learned about that was that our economy was consumer-based. And every country in the world, every company in the world wanted to do business and sell in our market. We're typically not interested in doing a lot of stuff in China, although we've moved to China because of tax reasons and because of cost. But our economy is not based totally on our ability to export goods and services. That's the drawback to this economy for China, and they recognize this. So when we talk about tariffs, tariffs do hurt Americans and American consumers, ultimately, because with manufacturers and businesses that import Chinese goods where there's a tariff, they pass that cost on to the consumers. So the American people are paying the cost of the tariffs. But what tariffs are, is not an end in itself. The purpose of a tariff is to force, coerce, encourage that country that is in violation of fair trade to come to the bargaining table and negotiate something different than what they're doing. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage there, because you've been reading a lot about tariffs. Just so you know, these tariffs are having an effect on the Chinese economy. They're also having, to a certain extent, an adverse impact on certain industries in our country. But over the long haul, these tariffs are being used to encourage China, in this case, to come to the table. Now, having said that, China is not the only country that we trade with that gets involved in unfair trade practices through subsidies, as well as some other things. And we're going to talk about that. One of the biggest problems in recent times, this goes back to the late 90s and the early 2000s, China saw that there was a big market here, particularly in the West Coast, particularly California, for solar energy, renewable energy. We were talking about that before the rest of the country even knew what it meant. So what the Chinese began to do was dump product into the United States. Now, the term dumping means that a is able to sell their product in another country far below the cost of manufacturing and transportation to them. It's called dumping. And what dumping does is it disrupts the normal flow of business, because if you are making solar panels in the United States and you have a business, you have overhead, you gotta pay for your facility, you have employees, you have the cost of goods, you have taxes, you have benefits you have to pay all these people, and pretty soon that raises the price that you have to sell your product for to make a profit, so that you stay in business. The approach for China and some other countries, and I'll give you some examples of that. Remember, China has to export. And as I said earlier, China is a country with a long history, 5,000 years. These guys have been around. The United States, let's put this in perspective. You know, we're just a little bit over 240 years. Just a little bit over 5,000 years of doing what they do best. Okay? So, the industry here saw that these guys were selling solar panels and solar, in effect, equipment far below anything that they could sell. Typically the way, okay, so they then brought charges against China with the Commerce Department, and China got fined. Tariffs were imposed so that they would stop doing this unfair trade practice. What these unfair trade practices do in this country is it reduces domestic companies to compete. And that results in shrinking of the domestic market here, and ultimately results in the layoff of employees, and in some cases, the closing of the actual manufacturing facilities. Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. Has anybody been to Qatar? Or Dubai? Dubai?
Yeah.
In Dubai, an amazing city.
Yeah.
You know, when last time I was there, I stayed at the Fairmont Hotel. I was on like the 35th floor. It was so modern, and they gave me this real plush room. You know, I could have stayed there. I mean, I could have lived in this place. But then you look out of your window, and next door is sand. You know, because it's essentially a desert, right? But they made the city. When I was there, it was near Christmas, and I don't know, well, I'll tell you two quick stories. It was near Christmas, and we were going to the son of some sheikh's beach home for a party. And as I walked out of the hotel, I saw these two very hip cars that I'd never seen before. And I went over, and the doorman told me, this is the new Bentley coupe. I said, really? I said, I've never seen that. So he said, yeah, this is new, it's very hip. And it was a beautiful car. So I determined that when I got back to Los Angeles, I was going to go there on Wilshire Boulevard and test drive one of these. Okay? So, like I said, this was just before the holidays. I get back, and we don't even have one in the United States. The guy said, we don't get our shipment until March, but it was in Dubai. Okay. So United Arab Emirates and Qatar, little bitty countries. And the Emirates, Everybody starts off with $30,000 a year, just based on oil income. And it goes from there. So these guys decided we need to have airlines of our own. And we want it to be world class. Now, when was the last time you heard anybody going to Qatar? I only went there on business once, and I don't have to go back. So what these guys have done, because they wanted to get into the airline industry, they wanted a big 747 with their name on the vertical stabilizer. They started buying up airlines in Europe that were not doing well. And because they have a lot of oil money, they were able to do this. And in one case, I think it was Qatar, yeah. Qatar went to Sardinia, and Sardinia Airlines was almost bankrupt. So these guys go in and buy 49% of the business, and they immediately equip Sardinia Airlines with just tons of new equipment, airplanes. And because they wanted to create a market, they began to arrange flights from Sardinia Airlines. You probably can't do it anymore, but the Sardinia Airlines was flying to the United States, Europe, the Middle East, and for, 25% of what the normal rate was, but they were being subsidized by the host countries because they wanted to develop this market. Needless to say, the American airlines industry filed a grievance with the Commerce Department, and it ended up with a major tariff, and it was a big lawsuit and stuff. So what my point here is, a lot of countries don't necessarily believe in free trade. Their concern is their country first. You've heard that in this country a few times. But unfortunately, we have to adhere to the rule of law. All right, so controlling resources, okay, is again what our problem is with China. Now, here's an interesting, this is a real case, and I remember talking to this guy with Newt Gingrich. Okay, Paul Wellbell and his father started a cabinet business 62 years ago. They started in Florida, and they started building cabinets. It was 1957. Paul told us that about 15 years ago, he noticed the involvement of the Chinese in the furniture business. And it was new because these guys were showing up, and heretofore they weren't around. What's interesting is most of the furniture businesses in this country are usually they're in the southeast, North Carolina, stuff like that. Some of the old things like Thomasville is an example. So here's what Paul was saying. About 15 years ago, he noticed that more and more they were seeing Chinese coming into the country, Chinese business people, and they wanted to do business here and they wanted to sell products. And he said, the way it starts is by the Chinese manufacturers. They make complex and labor-intensive parts that would go into the assembly of something that was being manufactured here in the United States. And he said, over time, what he noticed was that the next move that they made was they would begin to sell complete components, like tables and chairs, and they set a whole unit in. And they weren't just selling these little components and parts. Hello? Okay. Then he said, when they started doing that, you ended up, the domestic or the American furniture manufacturer became a distributor for these Chinese products, in addition to your own stuff. You know, they were selling them through you. And then he said, within the next couple of years, the Chinese company would come to the United States and they would establish their own distribution system. So now they're no longer using the domestic distributors. They have their own system. They're importing their goods. And they're selling products very cheaply. The number that, Paul is very involved in the National Association of, I think it's called Furniture Manufacturers or something like that. And this organization has determined, they reported that there were 130 companies that went out of business in since the year 2000 because they can't compete with what's coming from China. Now, the cabinet industry that Paul's in employs roughly 250,000 people. This is both directly involved in the cabinet business as well as their suppliers. And what he's saying now is, and this is now being argued with the U.S., we have a cabinet level person called the United States Trade Rep, and his job is to develop trade arrangements with countries around the world and to also get involved in trade infractions. Between the U.S. Trade Rep and the Commerce Department, if there is a complaint about unfair trade practices, these two guys get involved. But the Trade Rep really is, that's his only function. Okay, so here's what Paul told us. He said that typically what happens is on a particular type of cabinet that he's been building. Now remember, these guys have been doing this for 62 years, and they've improved their quality, they've innovated, they figured out a way to make a better cabinet more efficiently and less cost. And here's what he says. He said, if we have a cabinet that is selling for $150, these are like kitchen cabinets and that sort of thing. He said, when you see someone selling it for $50, you know there's a problem. And he went on to say that that's now being researched and investigated by the Commerce Department and the U.S. Trade Rep. That industry, by the way, I tell you about the numbers of people, 250,000 people are employed in it. It represents a $10 billion industry in our country. So when we talk about subsidies, don't hold me to this exact number, but the Chinese government has roughly $30 different programs that provide subsidies to countries that are that are exporting their goods outside the country. Now, these can be direct things like tax breaks, actual cash, things that they call our research and development. They can remit payments for like power, electric and gas, you don't have to pay for it. And there are other things there, but there's like 30 different types of subsidies that a Chinese company can get. So, that's unfair, right? Now, as we talk more about these tariffs, if you are an American businessman and you're trying to run a business, you're employing people, what do you want the government to do? Do you want to do nothing and you just ultimately go out of business? Because what will happen, and what has happened in the case of the airlines, as I was getting into, once a number of businesses is driven out of the market, now you have the opportunity to begin to raise your prices, okay, because your competition is gone. So that's what we're facing right now with these tariffs. The tariffs, but again, I want you to remember, tariffs are not an in and themselves. It's just it's a tactic used to achieve an objective. There's strategy and tactics, right? Your strategy is to end up with fair trade practices. The tactics, one of the tactics you can use is tariffs, okay? But tariffs typically aren't going to be imposed for extended period of times because ultimately it hurts the person who's trying to export to you, as well as it's hurting the people in this country who are affected by the tariff. And ultimately the person that's affected is the consumer, particularly as competition shrinks. Now, let me give you one, see, again, operating under the rule of law like you've seen with Hong Kong, Singapore, United States, Western Europe, or Eastern at this point too. We believe that certain things like intellectual property are of value, and that you can't just take someone's property. I have a cousin who's a producer, a movie producer, and he used to work with John Singleton years ago. He was involved with higher learning, Boys in the Hood, all that stuff. I think his last movie was the Johnson Family Vacation. And I remember him, so I went to the premiere of this, the Johnson Family Vacation. And 2 days later, he calls me and he's, well, this is not my words, I'm quoting him. He said, "I'm pissed off all to be damned." I said, "Well, why?" And he said, 2 days after the movie premiered, he found out people were selling DVDs on the street. Now, that's money coming out of his pocket, right? Okay. It's intellectual property. When I was for a couple of years, I ran a rice business in Jamaica, and this is back in the days before you could stream, so you'd have to rent a DVD, right? And I can remember renting movies from the local DVD store, and there'd be a trailer, not for sale or rent, property of the county. They didn't respect trademarks, okay? Those things affect the people who put money into this and made it. You know, producing a movie is not cheap. You got all these units to deal with, you know, I don't know all the intricacies, but being a producer is a big job. I want to just tell you about another form of unfair trade. And this is with, I think, yeah, Roddy, I lost myself. Roddy Dow. Charlotte Pipe and Foundry Company. Now, I know you're getting a little bored here, brother, because you heard all this yesterday, but please bear with me. Really a kind fellow. Good looking and smart. All right, so, Charlotte Pipe and Foundry is an interesting company. It was started in 1901 and in a little town, North Carolina. Roddy's grandfather actually started this. And the reason he started it is because he had this vision of North Carolina growing. And the fact that you were going to need building supplies. Every house has pipes. Every city has pipes, drains, things like that. And this is back in the days when a lot of pipes were made out of cast iron. So this company started then, and his grandfather's thought was, look, we're still dealing with post-bellum Civil War. This is 1901. This is a long time. The war ended a long time ago. But he was doing this in the vein of the South needs to rebuild. This company, over time, has become one of the major pipe manufacturing companies in the world. Now, they don't sell in every country in the world, but they're world famous. And typically, people have an opportunity to buy their products. As I said, it's one of the oldest, largest, and best known manufacturers in the country. So, because they sell abroad, you're familiar with these conferences where people show their wear and they have booths and that kind of stuff as a way of advertising in different countries. So, one day, one of their vice presidents in the marketing department is in Asia at one of these conferences. And he's just attending. They don't have a booth. But he sees their logo and someone there at a booth that says Charlotte Pipe and Foundry Company. And it's not them. And it's a Chinese company that has stole their logo, and because they are a famous company, typically people who are interested in pipes, seeing this, would buy from these guys. That's theft, right? But remember, Sun Tzu says there's nothing wrong with that. Deception. You know, you want to achieve an objective, you want to sell pipes, you do what you need to do to sell pipes. I'm not making this up. What we have to understand in the West is that the West does not corner the market on thoughts and beliefs. And what we have to do is meet people on their own terms. You know, when you hear people talk about leveling the playing field, it depends on what field you're on and what side of the team you're on, okay? So what we have to do is understand where China is. China wants to dominate the world. China is not this harmless little nation that we wanted to believe at the end of the 20th century. In fact, China, in the last 40 years, has had 2 wars. They went to war with India and Vietnam over borders. So let's not underestimate what China's done. Now, remember earlier on I talked about acquiring more territory and resources. China is building islands out in the South China Sea. They say it's part of China. And they say this is all harmless domestic. But suddenly you see landing strips out there, and then through satellite technology, you see missiles being located on these islands. And those are not things that typically you see at a normal airport, or a commercial airport. So this notion of expansion is real. What we have to appreciate is from the top down, their approach to governing is significantly different from ours. From the top down, when you deal with China, you're not dealing with company to company, or even government to government. You're dealing government to the Chinese Communist Party. And that makes a difference in how you should look at Minister Xi. He's not just president of the People's Republic of China. He is Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party and chairman of the military commission. He's got both the ability and authority to make rules and set rules, and he's got an army that he can use to enforce them. Remember, 90 million people are in the Communist Party, and they permeate every aspect of life in China. They may not necessarily object or obstruct what people want to do, but you can be absolutely certain that they're reporting back what goes on. So as a result, you don't see people, and particularly since Tiananmen Square, you don't see people holding demonstrations against the government. Those people typically disappear. So that's what leads us to where we are right now with Hong Kong. Hong Kong, Singapore, and to a certain extent, Taiwan, pose real problems for this communist government that we think is so benign in China, because these guys want to take away power from that central dictator and the party. So the whole controversy with Hong Kong centers around the rule of law. Now, it's sort of a screwy case that precipitated everything, but the case is the same. What the people in Hong Kong, by the way, this lady is probably the best IT person you could ever find. Okay. I don't know how Lamargo finds all these wonderful people, but I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right? All right. So here's what happened. The people in Hong Kong are used to the rule of law. So here's the story. This guy and his girlfriend leave the country, and this guy ends up killing his girlfriend. He comes back to Hong Kong. The people in China investigate this, mainland China, and they realize that this guy's guilty of murder. So they want him extradited to China to stand trial. as opposed to a standing trial in Hong Kong. The people in Hong Kong are really frightened about this because they see this as China encroaching on their rule of law. Now, I don't know if I had it on the board here, but this whole notion of rule of law expires in 2050 in Hong Kong. So they are really concerned about how this is going to work because these people are used to being able to go to court like we do here in the United States and have a voice and be heard. So the Chinese government wants to bring this guy to stand trial back in the mainland China, and that's what's causing the controversy. Now, what added to that is the fact that although they have elections in Hong Kong, and they have a mayor and effectively a city council or something, the people in Hong Kong don't get to select who those candidates are going to be. They are appointed by mainland China, and then these people in Hong Kong get to vote for whoever is on that slate. If you noticed, there was a lot of calls for people from the people in Hong Kong to have the mayor resign because she was not their person, and they didn't think that she stood strong enough against the government with regard to this extradition thing. Hong Kong represents a big problem now for Mr. Xi because of these kinds of things. Cameras, televisions, you know, you can hide for the most part in China, but the rest of the world can see what's going on. And these students showing up, stopping the traffic at the airport, that causes quite a scene. Now, the question becomes, how does she handle that? Because what he does is going to reverberate around the world. People are going to see that, and they're going to look at China based on what he does. This is different from Tiananmen Square because we didn't have all the forms of communication. We had CNN back in, was it 1987 when Tiananmen Square took place. But now, in Hong Kong, people have phones, iPhones, and stuff. They can do videos, post it, and that stuff gets around the world. So this is a tough time for China too, because she changed the way China operated under Mao. And he opened up the economy, as he said, because he didn't care if the cat was black or white. He wanted something that was going to drive the economy so that the government, the party, would be safe. When people are unemployed and hungry, it destabilizes a government, or in this case of China, the government is actually the Communist Party. And these guys are interested in preserving their jobs just like our elected officials. So I want you to notice now how China reacts to what's going on in Hong Kong, and see what happens with this trade stuff over the next 6 months. Because remember, China's got to export to keep their economy rolling. America is the largest market in the world. Okay, we have people who buy stuff, both when they have money and when they don't. And everybody wants to sell here. So if these tariffs are having their effect, it's having a bigger effect on China. And the way these guys ultimately are going to come to the table is going to be something worth watching, because it's not only going to affect trade, it's also conceivably going to affect the way China governs itself. China does not want there to be videos on the evening news showing the military shooting kids. That doesn't work good for them. So somehow they're going to have to come to grips with it, and it'll be interesting to see what she does. So, I'm going to give you guys a hokey little joke. This Catholic priest, I can tell Catholic jokes, I'm Catholic. This Catholic priest is counseling kids, and it's called pre-Cana. This is people who are planning to get married. And in the course of the seminar that these people have to take before they get married, he also tries to bring in people who've been married for many years successfully, so they can talk to these kids who are about to enter. So, at one point, he says to this group of young people with the older couple there, what is the difference between being complete and finished? Don't be bored, okay? And everybody's coming up with definitions. And finally the old man there says, if you marry the right girl, you're complete. If you marry the wrong girl, you're finished. I'm done. Any questions? Now, ladies and gentlemen, please understand that if you don't ask questions, well, Margot's going to get annoyed at me, and I'm going to be in trouble. So, anything I left out? Anything you're not sure about? Was I clear? Okay. That's the nicest thing I've seen in 6 months. Okay.
Isn't that good to give the teacher a grade? I'm gonna grade him.
Okay.